afternoon. This is Gönül Tol with the VantagePoint at the Middle East Institute, and I'm joined by Mr. Hişyar Özsoy today. I'm very happy to have you with us. He is a member of parliament from the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, the HDP, and he's currently serving as the vice co-chair of the party in charge of foreign affairs, and also a member of the Foreign Affairs Commission of the Turkish Parliament. Hişyar, welcome, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. Let me start with a very recent development. Iraqi Kurds have finally set a date for their long-discussed referendum on independence from the rest of Iraq. The Kurdistan regional government is calling for a vote on September 25th. And of course, Turkey's official policy has always been opposing an independent Kurdistan, fearing that that would spark similar demands among its own Kurdish minority. But under the ruling party, Turkey has cultivated very close ties with the Kurdistan regional government, signing energy deals and almost laying the economic foundations for an independent Kurdistan. And yet, after the KRG's announcement, Turkish Prime Minister called the move irresponsible and reiterated Turkey's support for a unified Iraq. But President Erdogan, as far as I know, has not uttered a word. What does that mean? Is that a tacit approval, you think?
I don't think there is a tacit approval, and President Erdogan is pretty much opposed to that idea of a referendum or independence of the Kurdistan regional government. Only he is trying to manage the process. The leadership of Kurdistan regional government has invested a lot in Turkey, particularly in Erdogan, in his personality, in his family. There are business contracts between the two families. In a way, the KRG has been trying to buy the consent of the Turkish leadership through economic ties, particularly in the field of energy, a field that is under the control of the son-in-law of President Erdogan. But I don't think that these kinds of economic interactions, these kinds of deals in the field of energy are sufficient to convince the broader Turkish establishment for an independent Kurdistan at this point.
Given the upcoming elections in 2019, I believe that would make it even more difficult for President to publicly approve such a move.
Exactly, because particularly after the abortive coup, President Erdogan has made a very powerful deal with the ultranationalists. Mr. Devlet Bahçeli in particular, the Nationalist Movement Party, as well as some other ultranationalist sectors. And so, in that sense, I said he is trying to somehow balance these two. They will be strongly opposed to the KRG's decision. They are already pissed off this decision about a referendum. In fact, Mr. Bahçeli insulted the KRG, who is a partner of Erdogan. So oftentimes, in such delicate moments, President Erdogan chooses to remain silent while the Prime Minister makes some comments to manage the process.
And how would this referendum affect Turkey's Kurds? I mean, what would be the reaction from Turkey's Kurds? Both on the referendum and also a potential declaration of independence, although I know they are separate things. Holding a referendum doesn't mean declaring independence, but how would this affect the calculations, the vision of Turkey's Kurds?
Yeah, I think the point you made is a very crucial one to underline, which is having a referendum is really different from actually having an independent Kurdistan. This referendum is going to empower the leadership in its negotiations with Baghdad, with regional powers.
The leadership in Kurdistan regional government.
Yeah, exactly. President Barzani, I mean, and the political leadership there. And this will empower them in their negotiations with both regional and global powers. But I don't think that they will be rushing for independence, given that their global allies are in favor of a unified Iraq still. And they have clarified their position. The United States, Germany, and also regional powers like Iran and Turkey, there is still a lot of work to do to convince at least some of these actors in order to have an actually independent Kurdistan. How this is going to impact Turkish Kurds? The fact is that the Kurdish question is no longer a question that can be contained in one particular nation state in the Middle East. It is all this. I mean, in the past, people would say Iraq's Kurdish question, Turkey's Kurdish question, Syria's Kurdish questions, Iran's Kurdish question. But these questions, because of the sweeping transformations in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq and in Syria and in Turkey, now we have a regional Kurdish problem. And only these countries are a part of that problem. At one point, in fact, in one of the interviews, I said Turkey no longer has a Kurdish problem. There is a Kurdish problem, and Turkey is a part of it. So in that sense, anybody interested in the Kurdish issue, both analytically and politically, they need to have an integrated approach, because these questions across the borders of those nation states are truly intertwined now. And definitely the developments in Iraqi Kurdistan would impact the political climate in Turkey. Mostly, I would say the Kurds would be happy with the referendum, the results. And Turkey is pretty much, of course, scared of an kind of independent state there for other Kurds to emulate, take as a model. That is their main fear. And unfortunately, that has been infecting Turkey's regional policy, I should say. They are still perceiving the Kurds as a threat. They may have good relations with President Barzani's family, with Nechirvan Barzani, but from the viewpoint of the broader Turkish establishment, of course, they are not ready to accept the emerging Kurdish reality in the Middle East. So it's going to complicate things. And probably other Kurds would also raise the bid a little bit, because I mean, now there is a model there. I mean, imagine in Turkey, if you think people are not even allowed to have mother tongue education. Imagine that 86 Kurdish mayors are in prison. So many deputies, Kurdish deputies, are in prison. There is almost no political space for Kurds to articulate their grievances. And on the other side of the border, you have an independent state.
Well, just speaking of that transnational nature of the Kurdish question, what do you think, because we know there is a PKK presence in northern Iraq, and the PKK Syrian offshoot is experimenting a new model in northern Syria, and this has emboldened Turkish Kurds, the PKK. So given all these interrelated, complicated dynamics, how do you see the PKK's strategy? And I'm asking the PKK strategy because what the PKK decides to do in northern Iraq and northern Syria, I think it's closely linked to your party's political fortunes. So that's why I'm interested in your take on the PKK strategy. For instance, in northern Syria, the YPG, the Kurdish militia there, and Turkey considers that as the Syrian offshoot of the PKK, that its military success in northern Syria is hitting significant geopolitical and demographic barriers. And this places the PKK before a stark choice, either to subordinate its Syria project to its fight against Turkey, or prioritize more Kurdish self-rule in Syria. So which route do you think the PKK will pick?
I don't think that they're going to have an either or kind of position. They probably will try to have both and position there. So let me elaborate on one point. There has been an argument that the PKK, whatever the PKK is doing there, is hurting the HDP. I'm just putting it in very blunt terms. And that, I would say, partly that's true. That's true, of course. I mean, the HDP as a political party, we emerged out of the peace process, and we are trying to build peace. And if we can't deliver, if we can't keep that promise, then the space of our political action is quite limited. But here is the situation. We need to have a kind of structural approach to this issue. The PKK is an armed political movement, active in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. Unlike the HDP, we are only a party for Turkey. We don't, for example, have a policy on, say, Syria or on the Kurds in Iran or in Iraq. But the PKK does. So from time to time, structurally, we come into conflict, I should say. There is a structural conflict there.
With the PKK's
Yeah, I mean, by
agenda.
that I mean, for example, when the peace process ended and the war started in the summer of 2015.
Yes.
So, of course, I mean, within that whole mass political violence, we were not able to organize, for example, for the November elections. So, but the argument that they are doing this, the PKK is doing this just to hurt the HDP is a bit, I think, over-interpretation. The PKK does have its own agenda.
Sure.
The HDP is a political party of only 3 years. We're a very young political party. But of course, we inherited a tradition of legal political struggle in Turkey, but we are a new political party, where the PKK has been in Middle Eastern politics over the last 40 years as a military force, as a political organization, and mobilizing Kurds in multiple countries. So in that sense, when I said, like, structurally, we do occupy different positions. The HDP is a party in Turkey for all peoples of Turkey, and we are trying to develop a democratic and peaceful resolution for the protracted Kurdish conflict. And of course, when the PKK and the Turkish government they start fighting, I mean, naturally, we lose most of the space for our political activities.
So, but then let me go back. My next question is going to be exactly that whatever the PKK does is hurting the HDP, and as a result, you mentioned, I mean, after June 2015 elections, the party's leader, Selahattin Demirtas, he could be appealed to non-traditional, non-Kurdish segments of the country. And he was viewed by many as the moderate Kurdish voice. And people believed in him. But after the ceasefire broke down, and he could be able to capture votes from those who had previously supported the ruling party. But after the ceasefire between the PKK and the state broke down, the PKK carried the war to the cities, city centers, and as a result, the HDP lost ground. So that was going to be my next question. But then let me rephrase it, because I think the PKK also lost ground. I mean, the PKK's new strategy in Turkey, I think it was not wise. It really hurt the people of the region. So the PKK lost ground even among its own supporters, among its own Kurdish constituency. So many people think that that's one of the reasons. And Selahattin Demirtas, the HDP leader, could not strike the right balance and sounded too close to the PKK, and that's why he lost ground. So is that the case? And if that is moving forward, what is the HDP strategy then? Because you're talking about a party that is almost squeezed between the PKK on the one hand, the state on the other, and it's trying to chart a new course in a very difficult political climate. So what is the HDP's agenda?
Okay, let me clarify a couple of things here, because I want to problematize a little bit your questions. For example, one is, whatever the PKK does hurts the PKK, the HDP, which is not really correct. Factually, it's not correct. For example, when the PKK was having a peace process with the Turkish government, we benefited from that. So it is not that...
No, I meant, I'm sorry, I meant if it escalates the war, I meant, let me put it that way.
Because after June elections, twice we were able to convince the PKK for a unilateral peace process, which the PKK was not really willing to do. only we couldn't have the government to respond to that in a positive way. So there were opportunities there, even after June elections, to resume the peace process, to have these warring parties to come back on the negotiating table. And I should say that the PKK responded positively, while the government was totally deaf to these demands. For example, Mr. Selahattin Demirtas himself, is now public knowledge, I can share it. Mr. Demirtas, he went to Kandil Mountains to convince the PKK for a unilateral ceasefire, which was successful in October 2015, just about 50 days before the November elections, when the PKK, on the day the PKK declared unilateral ceasefire, there was the bombing incident in Ankara. So in that sense, I think, I mean, just I wanted to clarify that thing. From time to time, of course, I mean, when there is no violence, when there is no actual fighting, as the HDP, we have much more ground. Why? Because we can communicate with broader sectors of the population in Turkey. And now, unfortunately, we don't have this. There is a climate of lynching everywhere. The government has totally criminalized the HDP as a terrorist party. Our co-chairs, deputies, all of these are in prison. And this has been the government's strategy to both pass this referendum and, you know, consolidate a particularly authoritarian rule. The second, whether Mr. Demirtas was able to kind of somehow balance out that, you know, balance things, manage things in between this, you know, very violent fight which started between the PKK and the Turkish army, the Turkish government. I think it is problematic to simply say that, like, I mean, the HDP just in between these two groups, trying to kind of carve up a new political terrain. No, the Turkish government, whatever they do, and the PKK, whatever they do, they shape the ground on which we do politics. Here is the, I think, key issue. What the Turkish government has been doing in Kurdish towns and provinces since the Suruç massacre is a military occupation of Kurdish geography. It's a military reoccupation. If you look at the photos even of, say, Nusaybin, of Cizre, you see heavy weapons, you see tanks, you see helicopters being used to destroy at least 9 Kurdish towns.
But the PKK has equally destroyed the Kurdish towns, hasn't it?
I think, no, that was different. I mean, because when the people are talking about those ditches that were dug by the youth, the urban youth, it started like that. And actually, I wrote a whole article about this. So in the beginning, it was just some neighborhood youth who dug those ditches to prevent the police from entering into neighborhoods and just taking people under custody. In time, it became militarized, actually, over a couple of months. I think initially the idea was maybe the President Erdogan wouldn't be so much aggressive, because in the past there were ditches in 2014, for example, when the government was building military stations in Lice, for example. People protested. There were those ditches there dug by the Kurdish youth. Even one youth got killed there. But after that, there was kind of a compromise and some negotiation, and started a new political process. Only this time, I think nobody was expecting this much militarization of those handak, what they call the ditches, that were first initiated by the Kurdish youth. It wasn't the PKK. It wasn't even the urban militia of the PKK. It was neighborhood youth. If you factually trace it, I mean, really what happened. And then the urban militia entered, and then about 3-4 months later, the PKK militants, they entered, although limited, but they were there, they were available there. So it was a process there. And you can, of course, criticize. I mean, this was quite, you know, problematic, that it cost the Kurds a lot. We can talk about the consequences and everything. But to my understanding, it was not a pre-planned project of the PKK. If you trace it, I mean, in those neighborhoods, really, and I did that actually, how it happened, how it started. So it wasn't just the PKK learning some urban warfare in Syria, coming there and having another urban warfare there. So it started differently. One needs to look at that trajectory. So whether Mr. Demirtas was moderate or radical or close to the PKK, I think the question should be asked in a rather different way. See, we are talking about a political context where military commanders are destroying Kurdish towns, and according to UN, killing at least 700 Kurdish civilians, destroying 9 towns with heavy artillery, and what the people expect of the HDP. Of course we are going to side with those towns and the people who are in those towns. That's what we did. 170 people got killed in 3 basements in Jizre, and the HDP had a very clear position. And now, only after the coup, the abortive coup, they are saying that those people who were destroying all those towns, every single one of them is in prison now. The military commanders who destroyed Sur, Shirnak, Yüksekyova, Nusaybin, these are all Kurdish towns, Jizre, all of them, they are in prison because they were a part of the abortive coup, according to the government. So what happened there was not, it wasn't simply, oh, the PKK fighting the Turkish state. We do think that the whole military coup was prepared there in those Kurdish provinces. It was cooked there. And when when you have the Turkish army and the police on the streets shooting at people, killing people, the HDP is, of course, going to side with Kurdish people there. Although we know that, I mean, it is a very, confrontational, violent situation. So, and we are not seriously after just some votes, because I would suggest anybody who is interested in the issue to just look at the photos. Those huge Turkish flags in destroyed towns, in Mardin, it was something different. And if it happens again, if the government again starts destroying some Kurdish towns, I don't think that the HDP's position will change.
Okay, so sorry, we're running out of time. So one last question, and this might sound awkward, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Your party leader is in jail along with several of your colleagues, and there's a state of emergency in place. But is there still hope? Very briefly.
Yes, I think there is always hope. If there is no hope...
Anytime soon, is there a return to the negotiations?
No, I mean, not anytime soon. We have to wait for what's going to happen in Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, which are these 2 places in Syria, and there is the Shangal question. And then we have the presidential elections in 2019, and every single institution in Turkey is bankrupt. It's not working. The Turkish leadership, there is no Turkish leadership actually now, although people say it is President Erdogan, but there are so many sectors, groups who are fighting for power, and the conditions are not ripe for the resumption of the peace process now. But we have hope because we know that this is simply not sustainable. Either we are going to find a way out and resume the peace process, or Turkey may turn into another Syria, which nobody wants, including global powers. So in that sense, although, I mean, times are quite difficult, challenging now, but we know that this situation is simply not sustainable. At one point, Turkey would come to that negotiating table, the Turkish leadership. They will come to that negotiating table. But we just want that to be done sooner than later, because we are having a lot of, it's very costly for the peoples of Turkey. So there is hope. There is hope.
Well, so let's end on that happy note, and thank you so much. This has been a great discussion, and thank you all for being with us today. This has been the Vantage Point for the Middle East Institute.